And today, he will talk to us about Wagner and Rousseau. So please welcome Simon Williams.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I will try to keep to 20 minutes, so I won't be playing any music, but I will just ask you to hold in your mind the forest murmurs sequence from Siegfried. Wagner's capacity to speak to succeeding generations about their particular anxieties has been demonstrated yet again in the past 2 decades by the increasing number of productions of The Ring that center on the unfolding disaster of environmental pollution and degradation. While industrial and political rereadings of Wagner's cycle in the 1970s and 1980s tended to focus on the damage caused to humans by the workings of their own greed and lust for power, in the early 21st century, nature has become the most recent addition to this grim toll. In the last few years, the most notable instance in the US of The Ring as a document centering on environmental pollution has been Francesco Zambello's production that unfolded over 3 to 4 years, first in Washington, D.C., and then in San Francisco. It was only in San Francisco in June 2011 that the cycle received a complete staging. We'll be hearing more about this production later in the conference, so I don't want to give a detailed account of it here. Suffice it to say at this point that through the use of video sequences projected onto the stage curtain during almost every purely orchestral passage, a tale was told of the appalling impact of smokestack industries, war, and consumer culture on the natural environment. Toward the end, the pollution began to clutter the stage itself. When they made their last appearance in Act 3 of Götterdämmerung, we saw the daughters of the Rhine wading through filthy water cluttered with plastic bottles, rusty auto bodies, and the choking litter of everyday life. Given the urgency of our current environmental crisis and the no longer incipient but current onset of global warming, readings such as Zambello's are timely. But oddly, her production seemed in part to fall victims to the very forces that it inveighed against. By this I mean that the dependence on video to carry the main message of the production, that we are destroying ourselves in our own offal, seemed to draw the director's attention away from moments in the action when we are made aware of pollution working within and changing the characters. I have in mind, in particular, the changes that Siegfried undergoes, and my starting point is Act 2 of Siegfried, specifically the staging of the Forest Murmurs sequence. Zambello chose, like many other directors, José Vila, Sergio Morabito, Robert Carson, and Caspar Beck-Holten come to mind, to set the entire action outside Fafner's cave in an industrial wasteland, in this instance inside an abandoned factory that was probably used for the manufacture of weapons. Only late in the act, when the back wall of the factory is pierced by a tank driven by Fafner, for the only time in the production do we have a glimpse of nature in the slender trunks of an aspen forest. Even during the Forest Murmurs sequence earlier in the act, nature is absent. This is a significant omission because it does not allow us to appreciate to the full the catastrophic changes that Siegfried is undergoing and will continue to go through in the final passages in the cycle and might tell us a lot about pollution. To explore these, I'd like to go back to the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The thought of Rousseau was almost certainly not to the fore in Wagner's mind when he was writing the poem and score of The Ring. He was never reticent in telling people whose work he was reading and whose ideas were governing his thinking. And it is more than likely that Schopenhauer, if anyone, was the thinker most completely occupying his mind while composing Siegfried. Rousseau, in contrast, was at best part of the background of The Ring. Nevertheless, Rousseau's writings still had currency, as they were fundamental to Romanticism, which marked so much of German culture in the early decades of the 19th century and was enjoying an extended life through Wagner's music dramas. Rousseau has gone down in the popular imagination as a utopian, as one who imagined the possibility of a world where humans lived at one with each other and nature. In actuality, he was the opposite, a dystopian, because the ideal world of natural humanity, which he most memorably explored in the Discourse on Inequality, 1754, in which humans could live in total freedom with nature and in spontaneous harmony with other humans, had passed untold ages ago. Indeed, as Rousseau himself admitted, this idyllic condition perhaps never really did exist. Nevertheless, the ideal provided a potent model, a yardstick even, by which one could judge the venality of the world in which one found oneself living. If one is to take Das Rheingold as the satire play of the Ring tetralogy, as a digest, as it were, of the longer action to come, then one could posit that the Rousseauian ideal of natural humanity is fundamental to the cycle's intellectual landscape. We never see a human being living at one within the natural world. Alberich, the first quasi-human we encounter, is decisively rejected by the daughters of the Rhine, who are themselves hardly the benign, passive natural creatures of Rousseau's imagination. Nevertheless, the action of the cycle rests, it might be argued, on the proposition that humans find greatest fulfillment and are therefore the least destructive when living in a natural state where their instincts are allowed free play. Indeed, the disastrous downward trajectory of Das Rheingold can be read as a process by which potentially free human beings are progressively trapped within a society in which the right to property and the prerogatives of power are privileged, a parallel to the unfolding condition that is figured in detail in Rousseau's The Discourse on Inequality. After the opening prelude, there are no lyrical episodes representing the natural state in the course of Das Rheingold, though Wotan, it should be noted, has an encounter with Erda that can be viewed as an equivalent to being in such a state. There are some notable passages in Act 1 of Die Walküre in which human and natural functions are elided. Siegmund and Sieglinde can be associated with Rousseauian naturalism. Siegmund memorably woos Sieglinde with the imagery of nature, and Sieglinde comes to realize her own identity and that of her brother through her sojourns in the forest, where she sees herself in the water, she sees her face in the water, and hears her own and Siegmund's voices in the winds. Their sexual union takes place not on the floor of Hunding's hut, though some directors would have it so, but out in the forest, an indication that the exercise of free sexuality is one of the prime ways in which human beings can celebrate their natural state. Siegmund and Sieglinde's status as exemplars of natural being is, however, remarkably short-lived, as the forces of Hunding, of that acquisitive society that operates on power and greed, are close behind them and, with the complicity of the gods, will destroy them. Through them, we come to understand the fragility and vulnerability of the natural condition. And while both characters at separate moments depart from the ring on moral high notes, they do so with an air of futility, as if the naturalism they embody has no staying power. Siegfried, the product of their Rousseauian fling in the forest, is the closest figure in the ring to Rousseau's natural man, whose purpose might be to restore a state of harmony between humanity and nature. How successfully he does this, of course, is open to question, and our ability to estimate his failure depends in part on our understanding of his condition as he is about to embark on his ultimately disastrous career. And at this point, I was going to play Forest Moments, but just play it to yourself in your mind. There's a special quality to Forest Murmurs. Despite Wagner's constant employment of exposition, the dramatic momentum of The Ring, and of Siegfried in particular, is persistent and ongoing. Excursions into the past, even the contest of questions between the Wanderer and Mime in Act 1, are taken primarily to add to our knowledge of the present and anticipate the future. Siegfried's forest reverie, however, seems to be of a different nature. The music that describes the reverie about his mother is the same music which describes the sun-dappled forest, and that too recalls the sun shining through the clean waters of the Rhine at the very start of the cycle. Siegfried engages in an excursion into the past to explore his origins, embodied in the mother whom he has never known. In doing so, he reveals a side of his character that is at odds with what we have seen of him so far. There is a pliability, even softness in him, and he displays an imaginative capacity that has the potential to make him a very sympathetic figure. Above all, and this is why I resist those productions that place him in a desolate industrial wasteland, this moment gives us the only extended insight into his association with pure, unpolluted nature, a moment equated with his birth. It is the state of innocence from which all will fall, and to realize this imaginatively, both in the staging and design, can give consequentiality to the subsequent action, make the pain aroused by Siegfried's career that much more acute, and endow the action with a greater dramatic impact. And for those who are committed to chronicling the influence that industry, war, and consumerism have on the malaise and decline of society, this scene is key, for from it we can see quite specifically how character can be polluted by the world within which it operates. Aspects of Siegfried as a Rousseauian natural man have been placed in context prior to the Forest Murmurs sequence. In Act 1, we learn that he has grown up in the forest, an upbringing that appears to be a mirror image of Sieglinde's excursions into the forest described in Die Walküre. Like his mother, Siegfried begins to learn who he is, and that his parents were different from Mime by looking at his reflection in the stream. He also has an acute sense of how nature provides models for the nurturing of life, when he sings of the birds, deer, foxes, and wolves suckling their young. Nature, as in Rousseau, provides humans with examples of spontaneous love as a fundamental dynamic in all relations. There is an impulsive generosity and curiosity in Siegfried that allows him to enjoy whatever he meets in the natural world. He even welcomes the idea of fear and responds to Mime's vivid evocation of the physical effects of fear by wishing that he could experience them himself. Siegfried also displays another crucial and less recognized tendency of natural man. He lives solely for the moment and discards anything that does not instantly serve his interests. Hence, once the bear that he has pursued on stage at the start to torment Mime is no longer required, he dismisses it. All these instances, with the possible exception of the bear, anticipate the intuitions that flood Siegfried's mind during the Forest Murmurs sequence in Act 2. However, there is enough evidence in Act 1 alone to throw into question the viability and ultimately even the value of the concept of natural man. Siegfried is not, of course, purely a child of nature. Whether the violence that is endemic to his character is the consequence of this upbringing by Mime, or an inherent quality within Wagner's conception of natural man is undetermined. But there can be no doubt that the brawling adolescent that we see for the majority of Act 1 does not accord well with the idyllic pastoralism of Rousseau's naturalistic Eden. While Siegfried may long for a purely natural home, it is clear that if he were to find such a place, he would be more than likely to wreak damage upon it. This is made fully apparent during the forging of Nothung. When Mime comes to tell Siegfried about his parentage, he gives him the shattered fragments of the sword, which Sieglinde had brought with her to his cave. Although Mime has no awareness of the symbolic aspects of this act, it is not too fanciful for us to read this as the bestowing on Siegfried of a gift from his mother. What Nothung stands for is complex. Tracing its theme back to the origins at the end of Das Rheingold, it embodies foremost the idea of human beings acting and determining their lives on a basis of spontaneity, without any restraints being imposed by the rules and obligations of social living. It was also the symbol by which Siegmund and Sieglinde consummated their love, thereby standing both for the celebration of free sexuality within a natural wilderness and, given their familial relationship, for a rejection of the most basic of social conventions when it comes to sexual relationships. The reconstitution of the sword may therefore be read as an attempt to revive the life-giving naturalistic energies that have, throughout the cycle, provided glimpses of an Edenic existence, the regaining of which still seems to be the main goal of human life. But the very conditions within which human life is lived make such a goal impossible. In the case of Nothung, this is made apparent by the way the sword is forged. From the start of Siegfried, hammering motifs and fragments in the orchestra, especially when Mime is singing of his incapacity to build a stout enough sword for Siegfried, constantly remind us of the affinity between Mime's smithy and the oppressive mines of Nibelheim in Das Rheingold. Siegfried, far from finding some other way to forge Nothung, takes up the tapping rhythms associated with Mime's forging at the start of the act and develops them into a massive, relentless pulse. Indeed, as Siegfried forges Nothung, the orchestra is not telling us that we are moving into a new utopia of nature, but the opposite. The bellows of industry are blasting us into a world that will be rife with pollution from machines and of the matter they unceasingly produce. The flames themselves arise from a tree that, according to Siegfried, he felled with his own hands. And this reminds us, crucially, of Wotan's breaking his staff from the tree of life, which led to the tree withering up and dying. So pollution and the death of nature is clearly anticipated by the end of the first act of Siegfried. So when Siegfried arrives outside Fafner's lair and relapses into memories about his mother, lulled by the sun-dappled landscape and birdsong, he's no innocent child of nature, but a conflicted individual whose impulses toward violence and the crude forcing of nature to follow his own needs is more than likely to destroy the temporary paradise in which he finds himself. My objection to the obliteration of nature at this moment in the action is that it misrepresents Siegfried by depicting him totally as an agent of industry, rather than as a more complex figure whose benign association with an instinct for nature is eroded by his own necessity to go out into the world and make his mark. The inevitability with which this pollution of the potentially heroic individual takes place is a central component of the tragic action of The Ring as a whole. Recently, in my experience, the only director who has to some degree caught the multiple and divided aspects of Siegfried at this moment was Achim Freyer in the much disputed Los Angeles Ring. Although Rousseauian naturalism was not one of Freyer's concerns during the Forest Murmurs sequence, during the Forest Murmurs sequence, he placed masked dancers representing Siegmund and Sieglinde dancing at the top of the steep rake that dominated the stage. The effect was to humanize his clown-like Siegfried by unexpectedly introducing a moment of pathos. Siegfried's consequent career through the remainder of the action was that much more illuminating and moving as a result. Another reason why the Forest Murmurs sequence should impress itself upon us as a critical encounter of Siegfried with nature is because this is the final instance in which the Rousseauian idyll is held out to us as a possibility. After this, Siegfried is bent upon a collision course with a society in which his natural instincts do nothing to protect him, and the natural world for which he is a major representative in the action declines as a result. Siegfried's relationship with nature changes once he can enter into a conversation with it. Fafner's blood, which spills onto his hand in the course of the fight between them, allows him to hear the song of the woodbird as human speech, as if a successful act of aggression, albeit against a monster that stands for the perversion and pollution of nature, has given him an active consciousness that will no longer allow him to adopt the passive attitude toward the natural world that was expressed in the Forest Murmurs sequence. In fact, if the utopia of oneness with nature has been a major value in the action of The Ring to this point, it is now abandoned, and Siegfried leaves for the mountain top, where Brunhilde lies sleeping, an even more energized figure. If his conduct toward the wanderer is any sign, aggression, acquisitiveness, and violence have a more pronounced presence within him than before. There may be grounds for claiming that Wagner's abandonment of the composition of The Ring at the end of Act 2 of Siegfried might in part have been motivated by this shift away from seeing ultimate value in the natural world. It may account, too, for the puzzling phrasing in Wagner's letter to Liszt, describing the abandonment of the project, in which he states that he has left Siegfried sitting under a linden tree, when in actuality he had already sent him off in search of Brunhilde. By imaginatively taking leave of an ideal Siegfried during the Forest Murmurs sequence, Wagner may have been removing himself and his work from the 70-year tradition of German Romanticism, which had been founded in large part on Rousseauian naturalism. I do not have time to articulate with precision what the alternative path is, but I'd just like to touch on two moments after Act 2 of Siegfried where characters go back briefly to nature. The first immediately follows the Act 2, when the wanderer visits Erda, as if going to his own source of wisdom in nature, to discover how to hold back the rolling wheel of those forces that are set to destroy him. The exhausted Erda has no advice to give him beyond trust in Brunhilde, a course of action Wotan has already cut off from himself. As it is, Erda seems already to represent a devastated earth, which suggests that whatever salvation Siegfried and Brunhilde may glean from their relationship, it will be temporary at best. The second counter with nature is, of course, Siegfried's meeting with the Rhine daughters in Götterdämmerung, just before his murder by Hagen. In this scene, he still shows traces of the younger Siegfried in that he has little awareness of the value of the things he owns. But he has lost any commitment to nature, any sense of its nurturing capacity, which had been the most positive aspect of his problematical character when we first met him. While the wanderer managed to generate a new confidence in the power of human love to guide events in his meeting with Erda, Siegfried reveals himself after his meeting with the Rhine daughters to be a man without value, without direction, an empty husk. I'd like to end where I began, with the production of The Ring in San Francisco. The finale of Götterdämmerung was unusual. First, all men were cleared from the stage, so whatever salvage work that remained to be done was done by the women characters. Then, as the Brunhilde theme took over the orchestra, a young girl carrying a potted tree came on stage as if to initiate a new movement back to nature. This was quite a moving moment, but whether it was justified, I'm uncertain. Rousseau, after all, did not think a permanent return to nature was ever possible. Once the human race had separated from the natural community, he made clear there was no going back. I would suggest that Wagner shared that vision. If a return to nature were possible, then judging by the stage directions that conclude the Ring, it is only by a cataclysm that wipes the slate clean, the River Rhine in this instance being the eraser. If humanity survives the ending, and it does now in many contemporary productions, then there is little evidence that nature will have much part in its recovery. Whatever the ending, the Siegfried of Forest Murmurs will no longer be a part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. And we do have time for some questions. There in the center.
Thank you for an interesting paper. Just one comment and a quick question. There's, of course, one more instance after Act 2 of Siegfried where a character interacts with nature, but it doesn't happen on stage. And that's when Brunhilde actually talks to the Rhine daughters and learns the whole back history of what's happened in Götterdämmerung and comes to understand fully the story before her peroration in the last scene. My question is about Siegfried's understanding of birdsong. Of course, he loses that ability in Götterdämmerung, and it's never specified that the magic potion is what did it, although I think many audiences assume that's how he loses that ability. How does that figure into your reading of his character, and would you say maybe it's something else, some development he experiences earlier that causes him to lose the ability to understand the voices of nature?
Well, I might have forgotten something here. Is there any point where actually it's brought to our attention that he doesn't...
Before he's slain, Hagen is speaking to him,
and he sees the ravens.
Right before that, he's narrating his back history, and he says, "You know, I used to be able to understand the voices of birds."
Yes, it seems to me that in some ways just sort of strengthens the argument I'm putting forward. That you know, when he moves into society, he begins to lose his connection with the natural world, and. In actuality, one of the best productions that ever did this was the San Francisco production before the current one, where actually a lot of the first three operas took place in nature, and then the last opera took place in a Roman setting, and you felt you moved into the city. I find that works very well. So you move into buildings, you move into a sort of a world that has been constructed by human beings. You don't hear birds there any longer.
If I'm remembering right, when Hagen prompts him about birdsong in that scene in Götterdämmerung, Siegfried says, "Since I've listened to the voices of women, I don't pay much attention to the birds anymore." So
and then we hear him listening to the voices of women in the Rhine daughter scene, and he's dreadfully dismissive of them.
On the other hand, but it fits exactly with what you said, Simon, because culture has replaced nature in terms of his interior life.
It's an interesting reading because I think often people just assume that by drinking the potion, his past is erased, including that ability, and it seems that your reading suggests there's another rationale.
I just wish that potion could be taken out. In the same way that I wish the potion in Tristan and Isolde could be taken out, because essentially what it is people do fall in love like that. It doesn't need a magic potion.
It's entirely unnatural.
Yes.
We have a couple more questions down here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. Very, very interesting talk. I was just wondering if there might be yet another instance of Siegfried's return to nature after his, we leave him under the linden tree in the second act, and that is the very complex musical example of the Rhine journey, the second prologue to Götterdämmerung. How does that fit into that? Isn't that also Siegfried merging essentially with the power of the Rhine, at least in the first half of Rhine journey?
We're now moving into sort of the realm of impressionistic music criticism in some ways. For me, it doesn't, But I'm going to go and listen to it again to hear if it does, because one gets this sense of the hero setting out, you know, in the most literal terms, sort of getting onto his horse and sort of going riding off. And eventually, when he gets to the Rhine, the music of the Rhine is not the rather sort of, you know, the dappled forest murmurs type music, which it has been at the beginning of Das Rheingold, but it's, you know, we get those very, very broad, that broad melody that almost suggests this is, you know, the hero going out into the world, where we're moving into the world of mighty deeds, which in a way does not belong to this Rousseauian world that I've been trying to identify.
Perhaps it's not a strict fit, but I think in terms of the power of nature, the elemental power of nature, it would seem to me another, in this case, purely musical example of that.
I take your point, and I'll look at it again. Yes.
And there was a question down here.
Yes, do you see any relationship between the ingesting of dragon blood in Siegfried and the blood oath ingestion of blood in Götterdämmerung?
Well, to the extent that ingesting the blood of the dragon leads him to understand nature, whereas the use of blood in Götterdämmerung is the opposite, isn't it? It's sort of, you know, they cut their wrists or whatever it is, they drink their blood in a sort of a bond that turns out to be a pretty poor bond anyway. It's easily broken. But it seems to me in some ways that maybe this moves in the opposite direction. That the drinking of blood in Siegfried actually is a moment where Siegfried grows. As I said, I'm not quite so sure if it's a growth that we should be entirely at ease with. I don't think when he drinks blood in Act 1 of Götterdämmerung, he gets caught up in society. He becomes a victim of the blood rather than somebody who can employ the blood to grow.
Thank you. We're just on time. If we move ahead now, if I can just inject one brief speculative comment, you can respond or not. I've been talking about Siegfried's upbringing with Mime in the forest. I was thinking of a contemporary of Rousseau, Condillac, who has a famous fable about two orphaned children who grow up in the forest, and the point of the fable is to recapitulate the natural origins of language, which was a point of much interest for Enlightenment thinkers, Rousseau included. So it gives one to speculate about Siegfried's education. He presumably learned language as well as smithing from Mime. His education, aside from what he observed in nature, his education was entirely dependent on Mime. I don't know if that's a point worth speculating on, but whether the separation from Mime, what it actually indicates in terms of his education, but particularly since you're talking about Rousseau and Rousseau's interest in language and music and their natural bases, one wonders about Siegfried's education.
It's an interesting point.
I don't think there's an answer. It's just an open question.
What about Herder's conception of language?
As a national sort of cultural binding agent.
Thought must come into the mind.
Yeah.
Before any word can be formed. And so word and thought are exactly the same. So even someone who never speaks still has the use of language because they're thinking in language.
Yeah, and that fits in with this whole sort of Enlightenment discourse of language, of trying to find a kind of natural genesis of language, that it should be more nature than culture or artifice.
I certainly think in Act 1 of Siegfried, Wagner wants to sort of differentiate Siegfried from Mime in two different ways. One is the question of nature, and there's also a generosity there. The other way is, I don't know, there was a second way. Oh yes, technology. This, by the way, is very odd, because Mime tries to teach him, and we all teach everybody else technology, and he says, no, I don't want that. He just sort of throws it all away, and he starts sort of beating out the sword. Though interestingly enough, he beats it out in the same music that in fact Mime has been used for Mime.
Right. We should now thank Simon and move along.